One of my cabinet members lost his son to overdose, and then 1 week later, I went to the funeral of a very good friend of mine's daughter.
This is all hands on deck.
Every day in this country, there are thousands of overdose emergency calls. On average, 115 people die every day. Those on the front lines say this is an all-out battle. This week, we're taking an in-depth look at what's being done to win the war against opioids.
And tonight, Barbara Moore Silva takes a look at the magnitude of the crisis and why it's everybody's problem.
Coventry Fire and Rescue.
The call comes in. Possible overdose.
This is all hands on deck.
The war on opioids.
Just when we think we've figured it out, the goal line changes.
Front and center, a more recent threat, fentanyl.
These substances are made to look like they're an opioid.
So if you're getting drugs from anywhere other than a pharmacy, you might think you're taking Percocet or OxyContin, but it's actually fentanyl.
Before 2012, it was less than 5%. For 2017, it's approaching 70%.
Almost 70% of overdose deaths from fentanyl.
Almost 100 times more dangerous and deadly than heroin.
This is a packet of sugar. It's not much. It's only 1 gram. That's enough to kill 5,000 people if it was fentanyl.
500,000 people in its purest form, carfentanil.
It's not necessarily a drug addict or a junkie who's going to be overdosing. It could be a loved one who's on some opioids who just takes the wrong dosage.
One of my cabinet members lost his son to overdose, and that funeral was really hard. And then 1 week later, I went to the funeral of a very good friend of mine's daughter.
What people need to realize is that the disease of addiction affects all of us in some way or another.
Including in my family. My mom, a school teacher, died when I was 16 years old, leaving behind me, my sister, and brother. Our dad told us she died from a brain aneurysm. Years later, when we needed her death certificate for some paperwork, we actually found out she died from an accidental overdose.
Using alcohol to excess was what got me started.
Former Rhode Island State Senator Tom Coderre had a very public fall after alcohol and drugs led to his arrest in 2003 on drug charges.
It was painful for me and for my family, but I got to the other side of it.
He is celebrating 14 years of recovery and is now Governor Gina Raimondo's senior advisor in the crusade against the opioid overdose epidemic.
I decided I needed someone who was like a full-time point person thinking about this all day long.
There are 3 barriers that prevent people from sustaining their recovery for the long term. One is housing, the other is education, and the third is jobs.
So it's boots on the ground from those on the streets trying to reach people in the throes of homelessness and addiction to what's going on behind bars.
Anyone who is being discharged from the Department of Corrections gets to sign up for what we call a safe ride, so that they, as they're being discharged, they have their medication-assisted treatment, they have their naloxone, and they also have a ride, to a safe place.
This is an all-out assault, education, treatment, and antidote.
Naloxone has saved a lot of lives.
And the numbers bear that out. In 2016, there were 336 overdose deaths in Rhode Island. That number dropped by about 100 in 2017. Health officials believe widespread use of naloxone by first responders is a big reason why. All this week, we'll be examining what's being done throughout southern New England to help reverse the opioid overdose epidemic. We hope what you'll learn is that we all have a role to play. Tomorrow, we take you on a response call with local first responders. With this special report, I'm Barbara Moore Silva, NBC 10 News.
It's not necessarily a drug addict or a junkie who's going to be overdosing.
We go in and help the patient as fast as we can, deconning them and getting them off to the hospital while keeping everybody safe.
Emergency first responders across the nation call to hundreds of overdoses each day. But as they fight to help patients, there's a new danger that's emerging. We're taking an in-depth look this week at what's being done to fight the national opioid crisis.
And tonight we talk to local first responders fighting the battle on the front lines. NBC 10's Barbara Moore Silva reports.
Coventry Fire and Rescue.
From the initial call,
We're in for responding for a possible overdose.
First responders are on their way within minutes, armed with the overdose antidote, naloxone.
We're working together to kind of protect not only our officers, but understanding more how to protect the people in the community.
This is not an actual overdose call. It's a drill demonstrating what happens when the call comes into first responders in Coventry.
With the opioid epidemic in Rhode Island, we started training probably last year on how to administer Narcan.
But it's getting more tricky to answer these calls.
Our officers are coming into contact, first-hand contact with it.
It is fentanyl, which is about 100 times more dangerous than heroin. All it takes is a whiff.
On a car stop, one of our officers was conducting an investigation. The wind picked up and kicked up some white powdery substance. At the time, we didn't know what it was.
A short time later,
and started to exhibit signs of an overdose. His fingers were numb. He started to feel dizzy. His speech was slightly slurred. Supervisor administered the Narcan. He was transported to the hospital.
Where after the Narcan wore off, he began to overdose again.
This stuff will last about 45 minutes, whereas opiates in your system could last up to 3 hours.
That officer survived, but others across the country have not. And that's why Coventry is implementing a fentanyl-specific response protocol. There are 3 levels. Level 1 is minimal risk. Level 2,
if we see a white powder, we tactically retreat. We get into an encapsulated suit. We go in and help the patient as fast as we can, deconning them and getting them off to the hospital while keeping everybody safe.
Level 3 is if multiple victims are down. Equally important is arming the community with knowledge that this can happen to anyone.
It's not necessarily a drug addict or a junkie who's going to be overdosing. It could be a loved one who's on some opioids who just takes the wrong dosage.
It's important to know the symptoms of overdose.
Blue lips, labored breathing, sometimes not breathing at all.
And arming yourself. Naloxone readily available to anyone at your local pharmacy. No prescription necessary. Those in the trenches will tell you that homelessness and opioid use disorder often go hand in hand. Tomorrow, we'll take a look at one group that's out there most days trying to make a difference. With this special report, I'm Barbara Moore-Silva, NBC 10 News.
And you often see just snapshots of folks when they're at their worst and when they're struggling and they're feeling their worst. So having some direct education around it is something that was lacking in my training.
In the war on opioids, homelessness and addiction, they often go hand in hand. And the fight to overcome both of those complicated issues can be daunting. Tonight, we continue our in-depth look at what's being done to win that war.
And Emily, we are learning firsthand what their strategy is. NBC 10's Barbara Moore-Silva takes us to the streets with a local group.
Being out in the street really gives you the opportunity to see and be a small part of people's lived experience.
It is cold, below freezing. In an area of Providence many won't venture out into at night.
I'm tired of it. I'm tired of it.
Here along Broad Street in this upper South Providence neighborhood, the stories are real.
I'm homeless and you're robbing me.
Megan Smith is an outreach program manager at the House of Hope, whose mission it is to prevent and end homelessness.
We certainly do have folks that we see time and time again.
Many who live on the streets in nooks and crannies are not only homeless, but addicted to drugs.
Do they contribute to each other? Absolutely. Folks who are experiencing homelessness have to find lots of ways to cope.
It is on these streets where Megan and her team work to make a difference.
Each of these pins represents a person that we've contacted, and we write down who contacted them and a little bit about what we spoke about.
Perfect.
They actively search areas where folks might be taking solace. Aside from distributing necessities like warm socks, they hand out clean needles and the overdose antidote, naloxone.
I'm a big believer that the wider the distribution, the better.
So when they find a kit in an area known to be used as shelter, it gives them hope.
I heard a great quote actually on the news this morning that from a first responder, and she said that every time I give someone Narcan, that's another chance for them to get into recovery. So anyone who says that Narcan is an enabling tool or anything like that hasn't been out here.
Is there a time frame where you think?
Dr. Craig Kaufman, a psychiatrist, is part of this outreach effort.
As a physician, you're going to see homeless people, and you often see just snapshots of folks when they're at their worst and when they're struggling and they're feeling their worst. So having some direct education around it is something that was lacking in my training.
I was homeless at the age of 16.
Part of this boots on the ground movement, Samantha Hill, who was not only homeless but addicted.
Cocaine, crack cocaine, we call it, and also heroin. So I want to get back to the community, help them, let them know that there is options out there, that there is ways of changing.
Part of that process, verifying someone really is homeless, which is often required to be eligible for housing.
Building that documentation that just because I'm not in a shelter doesn't mean I'm not homeless. I think the biggest function we serve out here is supportive listening and bearing witness to people's lived experience. Really just taking the time to listen to people and then learning from there how we can best support them.
House of Hope, one example of what's being done in our communities to reach, teach, and help people turn their lives around. Tomorrow we take you to 2 communities where first responders are making a difference. With this special report, I'm Barbara Moore Silva, NBC 10 News.
The one that always stuck out for me as far as that I needed to change the way that I reacted was a young lady who overdosed and died at 8 months pregnant.
It's the war on opioids. First responders take the lead when an overdose call comes in. But now, some departments are looking at ways to help after the initial battle is won. Tonight in part 4 of our look at the fight against the opioid crisis.
NBC 10's Barbara Moore Silva takes us to 2 communities where first responders are making a difference.
The normal culture of police is you only show up at a person's house during a moment of crisis.
But first responders are trying to change that.
Look, we're not here just to lock you up or throw you in the back of an ambulance.
Officers on the front lines of the opioid crisis.
We do care about the community.
Here in West Warwick,
it always ranked between 1 and 3 of the highest in the state.
Police Detective Matthew Beltrami and behavioral specialist Heather Seeger are reaching out just days after an overdose.
And we just show up and kind of say, hi, we're here to help.
And I just say, hi, no one's here is in trouble or anything. I'm out with the police department. I'm with the clinician. We're just here to offer help and we'd like to talk to you.
The cop and clinician team is part of a pilot community outreach program.
Personally, this has been one of the greater aspects I've ever done in police work, because you're not going there just for that crisis moment.
We've gone out and we've talked to 25 people directly. 100% of people get some sort of support attempt.
And for families of loved ones who don't make it, they listen.
Sometimes we sit for an hour with somebody and just reminisce. It's really just serving as a support and saying somebody cares that your loved one passed away.
And they link them to services. Something similar is happening in Dartmouth, the Recovery Assistance Program, based on one in New Bedford.
The officers being there is more of a presence, and they go in plain clothes. The forefront is going to be on clergy as well as the other addiction recovery specialists.
It can be easy for a first responder to become immune, used to seeing overdoses all the time, sometimes the same people. But just about every one of those officers has a story.
The one that always stuck out for me as far as that I needed to change the way that I reacted was a young lady who overdosed and died at 8 months pregnant.
Some have no record of drug use, like a young woman in West Warwick who thought she was taking a Percocet from a friend of a friend, and it was actually pure fentanyl, 100 times more dangerous. The overdose antidote naloxone saved her.
You needed 4 doses to come through. That was on scene.
It's about education and persistence. This team meeting daily.
He's doing well now and in treatment.
Oh, he is?
Yeah.
That's the one we've been to his house a couple of times.
A few different times, yeah.
Okay.
And now he's on medication-assisted treatment and doing well.
Medication-assisted treatment combines behavioral therapy and medications to help a person achieve recovery. And we'll talk more about that and the new program making it easier to get help, plus how we can all become equipped to possibly save a life. With this special report, I'm Barbara Moore Silva, NBC 10 News.
He was lethargic, he was shaky.
He said he couldn't do it anymore, and he said he was ready.
It's the war on opioids. Local communities on the front lines to help those battling addiction. Tonight, part 5 of our look at what's being done to end the opioid crisis and save lives.
NBC 10's Barbara Moore Silva shows us local programs already in place and one thing we can all do right now to get involved in the fight.
In an emergency, they come to you. But you can come to them now.
Absolutely no judgment.
They're called safe stations.
The program is designed so people have access to help and recovery in an easier way.
at all 12 of the Providence fire stations.
If you have an addiction problem and you know you're ready for help, at any time, day or night, you come to the fire station and you ring the doorbell, and we will bring you inside, welcome you, take your vital signs.
Then they call a recovery coach.
We go in and we can offer some hope. You know, we're like living examples of what recovery can be.
The first call a few weeks ago.
He was lethargic, he was shaky.
He said he couldn't do it anymore, and he said he was ready.
This team, recovery coaches from Anchor Recovery, responded.
Always in teams, because we're going to transport the individual out of there.
And into treatment. This program modeled after one in New Hampshire, where in just a year and a half, 5,000 people have walked through fire department doors.
I think that's very powerful when we teach that recovery is not only possible, but here we are.
And they may think I'm just another counselor.
Training more troops on the ground, recovery coaches, crucial.
But as I begin to share my story, a little slow by slow, just what I need to know, I feel them out, let them know, feel where they are. They become comfortable.
Follow-up making a difference. The guy who walked into the safe station.
He actually came by here. We helped get him a phone plan so that I could remain in contact with him.
Quicker and more access to help, training, jobs.
We need more resources so that we can do more.
And I want to go at this with that urgency that I would if it were my own kids.
Getting tougher on dealers.
Making sure that naloxone is everywhere, regardless of if someone in your family is dealing with opioid use disorder.
And it's easy to get.
Anyone can go and pick up naloxone at the pharmacy.
We sent our NBC 10 producer Caitlin Grimaldi to CVS.
Hi, how are you?
Hi, good. Can I get an order of naloxone, please?
Co-pays vary, but on our plan for the more expensive nasal,
The nasal is much easier for the general population to use.
the copay was $43.
Great, thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Small price for a life.
The more that the public has access to these medications, I think the better.
We want to make sure that there's naloxone in malls, in schools, in movie theaters, at home.
It's not easy to break addiction. This isn't a matter of saying, I'll just try harder. It's a disease.
This is all hands on deck.
It is all hands on deck, and it starts with us buying Narcan at our local pharmacy. Here's mine. You never know when you might need it. We have a lot of links to information and resources available in our community. Perhaps you're ready for recovery or know someone who is. Just go to turnto10.com and click on health. With this special report, I'm Barbara Moore Silva, NBC 10 News.